Good day, everybody. Welcome to the High Desert Garden. All right, so today what I'd like to do is talk about compost. So I'm out here and I'm at my compost pile, and I will be trying to see if I can use some of this compost today because I'm getting ready to plant a few things, and I want to be able to add some compost to the soil before I plant things like my pumpkins and other things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about compost because we all know how beneficial compost is for the garden, but I learned how to compost by watching many different YouTube videos, and there's a lot of different ways to compost, and you'll find that people do compost a lot of different ways. I mean, essentially, if you pile organic matter into a pile, eventually it'll break down. Some ways will compost quicker than others depending on what sort of ratios you use, how wet you get it, if you get it too wet or too dry, possibly even your climatic conditions, your environment that you live in, and either the hot or the cold weather that you get can affect how you compost. So in watching these videos, not saying that anybody is right or wrong, there's just so many different ways to compost, and I do not like to comment on other people's videos and say, hey, you're doing this wrong or whatever. I don't beat anybody up on their own channel, nor do I beat people up on my channel. So I will not mention any names, but I do watch a lot of videos, and there's been some people saying, things about composting that you shouldn't cover your compost with a plastic or a tarp because you're going to prevent air from getting to it. And really, I don't know that these people take into account things like different climatic conditions. Is this person living in a humid environment or a dry environment or a hot or a cold? And you just have to be careful and make sure that you qualify your statements, and maybe just do a little bit more in-depth thinking before telling people, oh, you should or shouldn't cover your compost. I find that it works really well for me because I'm in a desert here, and my compost pile tends to dry out really quickly if I don't at least cover the top. Now, if you remember, this compost pile used to be much larger, and I've actually used just a little bit of it, but for the most part it's just broken down so much that it's become smaller. And so this tarp used to just cover the top. In fact, it's quite small, so it still does not cover the whole pile. My compost pile gets plenty of air through the sides, and especially when this pile first started out and it was fairly large, this little piece of black plastic just covered the top. And you may remember the big fence circle cage that I had around the pile. So this helps do a couple things. It helps hold the moisture in. It can, because I get a lot of winds in the fall and in the spring, the tarp, I actually weight down the tarp because the tarp can help to hold the leaves and everything. And I realize that typically your compost will develop a crust on the outside, but I have so many leaves. I had so many more leaves than I did other green materials like grass and so forth, and that's the other thing you have to take into consideration. What sort of material are you composting? If all I had was a big pile of grass here, then yeah, I may not need a tarp at all for that. But like I said, I have a lot of leaves, and therefore my compost pile tends to get lots of air because of all those leaves that I have. And not only that, the leaves have a tendency to blow away if I don't at least cover it and weight it down. So there's other things you have to take into account in deciding, do I want to cover my pile? I just find that it works well for me. The pile does break down quicker. It does heat up better. And that's another thing is, I've heard somebody say, well, it's not the heat that breaks down your pile, it's the bacteria in there. And they hear people saying, oh, cover your pile to heat it up, it'll break down faster. And I think that people are misinterpreting what people are saying. When we're saying cover your pile, it'll heat up faster, it'll break down faster, you got to take into account that there's a meaning behind that, and that in covering it in the environment that I'm in, it's going to hold the moisture in there. So it is going to help heat it up because you're going to keep those microbes and the bacteria alive. Because if your pile dries out, your microbes are going to die, and then it's not going to heat up. So I think when people are saying cover that pile so that it can heat up, there's a combination of things. Also, if you are able to hold the heat in where the sun hits the tarp and does help to warm up the pile, especially in the winter, the warmer that you keep those microbes, the more active that they're going to be. And I realize they can generate their own heat, but sometimes in some conditions, they can use a little bit of help keeping warm. And so that's another reason for the plastic cover. So, you got to take everything into account. You can't just go start saying, oh, you're telling people wrong things, and that's not necessarily the case. During the summer, I pile up all my organic material into a corner. This includes prunings, grass clippings, anything organic that I get, I pile it up. I do not cover it with a tarp. This material contains a lot of water, and also during the summer we have higher humidity levels. Also note that I do not turn the compost all summer. At the end of the summer, here are the results. Rich organic compost teeming with life. Other thing that I've heard people say is never put pine needles in your soil. And for one, are we talking about pine needles that have been aged, pine needles that have been composted, or are we talking about fresh pine needles that have fallen off a tree recently, or green pine needles even? What kind of pine needles are we talking about? Because you can get different effects just based off of what types of pine needles that you're talking about. The other thing is, are people tilling them into the soil, or are they using them as mulch? You got to take this into consideration too. You can't say, oh, the acidity in the pine needles is why your garden is suffering because you tilled pine needles into your soil. It may not have necessarily been the acidity. How do you know without testing that person's soil, what area of the country they're in or whatever, how do you know whether or not they have very high pH or a low pH to begin with? You don't know if those pine needles hurt or help their pH levels. Typically, some other things that can affect whether or not their garden did well is if these were not aged pine needles or composted pine needles, you till that stuff into your soil and it's going to tie up your nitrogen, and that could be why your garden is suffering. Any unaged woody material that you till into your soil could tie up the nitrogen. And I've seen and heard other gardeners say where they till sawdust into their soil, and then they try to blame the back to Eden garden method. I mean, the back to Eden garden method has nothing to do with that. Back to Eden garden method has to do with mulching the top of your soil. And they say, oh, you still end up with the same crappy soil underneath all those wood chips. Well, for one, that's just not true. It actually improves the soil, especially over time. If you think about a forest, the organic matter falls, builds up, and it builds up better and better and better and better soil. And that's really what the Back to Eden garden method is all about. It's about building that soil up. If you think about it, we all have crappy soil if you go down far enough. I mean, you go down far enough, you're going to hit rocks. Now, this is how the earth started out, as rocks, okay? So, just food for thought on a few things. So, don't mean to go on a rant here, but like I said, I don't like to use names. I just watch a lot of channels. Want to clear a few things up. I believe in organic gardening. I believe in improving soil conditions. Some other things I've heard people say is that your plants can't tell the difference between organic fertilizers and chemical fertilizers. Your plants actually can tell, and I could go out there and I could research the information and I could find it, and I just might do that. But at this point, I'm going off of common sense, because if you've done any sort of research on this at all, you know chemical fertilizers you can build up salts in your soil. Your soil could essentially turn to dust. Um, it's been proven that chemical fertilizers can affect earthworm populations. So yes, over time, I think your plants are going to be able to tell the difference. I mean, if you're just using little bits here and there, it's probably not going to have nearly the amount of negative effects. But I certainly would never say anything like your plants won't be able to tell the difference, because that's just ridiculous. It's like saying that your body's not going to be able to tell the difference if you eat the fresh produce in your garden compared to eating at McDonald's. I mean, just think about it a little bit. So this pile, like I said, has shrunk down quite a bit, and I'm going to open it up, see what we got inside, hopefully. All right, so I've taken the first couple of inches off the surface of the soil of the compost pile here, and I'm seeing, chunks of leaves, but I'm also seeing, that they're really starting to break down. Looks like some very nice leaf mold going on there. So I'm going to dig into the pile a little bit more here and see what I can come up with. Oh yeah, I'm seeing some good stuff under here. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, good. There's some coarse material in here. So this is looking pretty coarse on top. But, oh yeah, look at that. A week ago, I added 1 full bag of freshly cut grass to this compost pile, and it has mostly been composted. I was only able to find small remnants of grass. Towards the bottom of the pile where the grass was also seems to have dried out. So I do have some grass that I added, mowed the lawn, and I put some grass in the center here. It is breaking down quite well. It's pretty warm in here. That's another thing. Research by a university recently indicated that you definitely don't want to turn your compost pile, especially when it's hot, because if you've ever turned your pile when it's hot, you see all that steam coming off of it, and it smells like ammonia. You're losing a lot of your nitrogen if you turn your pile when it's hot. So if I turn it at all, I definitely do it when it's cold. And the pile is just a little bit warm. And so I'm going to dig into this a little bit more, see what we got. Okay, so there was quite a bit of finished compost when I got down to the bottom of the pile, but for me it just was not worth sifting it yet, because there's still quite a bit of coarse unfinished material in there. I just want to give it a couple more weeks. If you remember a couple episodes back, I think back in December sometime, I did sift and get an entire wheelbarrow full of finished compost out of this pile. So I did expect it to be a little bit more broken down than it was, but hey, it's not a big deal. I'm not under any time constraints here. As I said before, there's many different ways to compost, and if you pile organic matter up, it's going to break down eventually. Nature will take its course, I promise you. Whether it be bacteria or fungi or whatever breaking it down, it's gonna break down. So for the time being, I went out, I got some organic compost with no manure in it or any biosolids of any kind. I've used this compost before. I really like it, and I'm going to use this compost in planting my pumpkins and running them up this trellis this year. Alright, so I have at this point added some water to the pile. I added a few more greens and piled it up real high, put the plastic back on top. It still gets plenty of air around the sides, especially through this direction. So I never have any problem with my pile stinking or any anaerobic activity. Like I said, you got to think of what your pile consists of, and determine is it getting enough airflow? I also do have some holes in the top of the plastic as well. I really enjoy making these videos for you guys, and I just like to bring information to you, so hopefully that was helpful. Well, I had to come inside to wrap up this video. It was just way too noisy outside. We got some children playing, dogs barking. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the episode and maybe learned a little something. Some people would say emulating nature, you know, building up that nice soil on your own property, in your garden, whatever, in order to add to the earth and not take away, you know, because if we don't start adding to, then, you know, it's only a matter of time before we use up what we've got. So I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Please subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up if you liked it. If not, give it a thumbs down, and I will see you next time.